The summer gala at the historic estate in Oak Haven, Virginia, was loud, hot, and crowded. Gabriel Cross stood near the far edge of the stone terrace, half hidden by the shadow of a large brick urn filled with white roses. He had white hair that caught the bright afternoon sun, and skin so pale it looked like polished marble. People in the town knew him as a wealthy, reclusive businessman who rarely left his property, but they did not know the truth about what he was. He was the Vampire King, a man who had lived through centuries of human history, ruling his hidden people with a cold, steady hand. He detested these high society gatherings, viewing them as tedious displays of vanity, and he only attended when local community obligations forced him to appear. He kept his eyes on the lawn, watching the guests chat and drink, completely detached from their small dramas. A few yards away on the lower lawn, a young woman stood completely alone near the edge of the woods. Her name was Maeve Linwood, a 22-year-old woman whose father had passed away 2 years prior, leaving her in the care of a bitter stepmother. Maeve wore a simple light green dress that was clean and neat, but clearly several years out of fashion. The fabric was mended carefully at the left shoulder, showing the quiet dignity of someone trying to make the best of a difficult life. Gabriel had noticed her earlier because she lacked the loud, fluttering energy of the other young women in the crowd. She held a small glass of ice water that she did not drink, simply observing the wealthy guests from a safe distance. Her face was calm and fine-boned, carrying a quiet stillness that made her look like she belonged to a completely different world. Suddenly, an older woman marched across the grass toward Maeve, her expensive silk dress rustling loudly with every sharp step. This was Victoria Linwood, Maeve's stepmother, a woman with a hard face and an angry look in her eyes. Gabriel could not hear the exact words from the terrace, but he could easily read the venomous expression on Victoria's face as she began to speak harshly to the girl. Maeve went entirely still, her cheeks turning pale, as she listened to the older woman's insults without moving a muscle. Victoria's anger seemed to grow hotter because the girl refused to argue or cry out in fear. Without warning, Victoria raised her right hand and struck Maeve hard across the face. The sharp sound of the slap cracked through the open air like a broken tree branch, instantly silencing every conversation on the lawn. The sudden noise caused 200 well-dressed people to freeze in their tracks, turning their heads toward the lower lawn to see what had happened. In that quiet second, Gabriel saw Maeve stagger slightly from the force of the blow, her head snapping to the side. But instead of crying, covering her face, or running away, she slowly straightened her back and lifted her head. She turned her face back to look directly at her stepmother, her dark eyes steady and calm, despite the red mark blooming on her pale cheek. She stood in absolute silence, refusing to give the older woman the satisfaction of seeing her break down in front of a crowd. Gabriel felt something stir in his cold chest, a sudden spark of respect for this human girl who possessed more courage than anyone else in the garden. He also looked at the crowd of wealthy onlookers and saw exactly how they chose to react to the violence. Not one person moved forward to help the girl or spoke up to condemn the stepmother's cruel action. Instead, the guests took a half-step backward, moving together like water shifting away from a dropped stone. Their faces quickly settled into expressions of eager curiosity and amused gossip, treating the young woman's pain as nothing more than an entertaining afternoon show. Gabriel realized that these people intended to stand by and watch the cruelty unfold without lifting a single finger to stop it. They would go home later, talk about the scandal for weeks, and eventually decide the poor girl must have deserved it to make themselves feel better about doing nothing. Gabriel was not a man who rescued people, having spent centuries learning that getting involved in human troubles was usually a waste of time. He had built a reputation for being cold, ruthless, and indifferent, and he preferred it that way because it kept the rest of the world at a distance. But before he could even reason through his own thoughts, his feet were already moving him across the stone terrace and down the wide steps. The crowd parted quickly before him, sensing the sudden, freezing aura of danger that seemed to follow his graceful movements. Victoria was already raising her hand a second time, emboldened by the silent compliance of the guests and Maeve's stubborn refusal to hide her face. She swung her arm forward, fully expecting to land another blow without any consequences, but she never reached the girl. Gabriel caught the older woman's wrist in mid-air, just an inch away from Maeve's face, his pale fingers locking around her forearm with iron strength. He did not use excessive force, but he held her arm so tightly that she could not move a single inch or pull away from his grip. The entire garden went completely quiet, the only sound being the soft splash of a stone fountain tucked away behind the rose bushes. Victoria turned her head sharply to see who had dared to interrupt her, her face twisting with sudden rage that quickly melted into terror when she saw him. She looked up into Gabriel's dark, cold eyes, realizing instantly that she was dealing with a man who could ruin her social standing with a single word. "I think not," Gabriel said, his voice very quiet and level, as he held her trapped arm in the bright sunshine. He had learned long ago that a calm, steady voice carries much further and cuts much deeper than any angry shout. He stood immovably between the cruel older woman and the quiet girl in the faded green dress, shielding Maeve completely from any further harm. The 200 guests stopped pretending to look away and stared openly at the strange sight of the town's most reclusive man defending a penniless stepdaughter. Victoria breathed heavily, her face turning pale as she struggled to find her voice in front of the entire silent gathering. "Mr. Cross!" Victoria gasped out, her voice trembling as she tried to pull her arm free from his solid grip. "Please release me at once. This is a private family matter, and you have absolutely no right to interfere in our business." Gabriel did not let go immediately, keeping his fingers locked around her wrist for a few seconds longer, just to ensure she understood her position. He looked down at her with a calm, freezing expression that made the older woman shiver despite the warm summer air. "I have made it my business," Gabriel replied, his voice dropping slightly so that it carried a sharp, dangerous edge. "By taking hold of your arm, I have decided that this matter concerns me, and I will keep hold of it until I am certain you are finished." He then released her wrist with a short, dismissive movement, tossing her arm down as if he were discarding a piece of trash he no longer wished to touch. He turned his back on her completely, offering the ultimate social insult, and focused his attention entirely on the young woman standing before him. Maeve was staring up at him with wide, shocked eyes, her breath coming in short, quick gasps as she tried to understand what was happening. There was a deep, exhausted wariness in her face, the look of someone who had spent years dealing with cruelty and could no longer trust an act of kindness. She looked at his white hair and pale skin, her eyes scanning his face for any sign of a trick or a prelude to some new humiliation. The red mark on her cheek was growing darker against her pale skin, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears that she still refused to drop. Gabriel did not touch her, knowing instinctively that she had been handled roughly enough for one day and needed space to breathe. He leaned closer, lowering his voice so that his next words were meant primarily for her ears alone. "Maeve," he said softly, using her name with a gentle respect that she had not heard in a very long time. He had overheard her name whispered by a gossiping guest on his way across the lawn, along with a brief mention of her status as an orphan. He spoke the name clearly, wanting to give her back a small piece of the dignity that her stepmother had just tried to strip away. He watched the effect of his voice move across her features, seeing her carefully guarded expression soften into a look of quiet disbelief. It was as if she had forgotten that anyone could speak to her with genuine kindness in the middle of a hostile crowd. "You know who I am," Maeve whispered, her voice shaking slightly as she fought to keep her balance on the grass. "But I do not know why you would care, sir. You should not have stepped in like this." She glanced quickly at the watching crowd and then back to Gabriel's face, her dark eyes filled with a sudden protective worry for him. "You do not know what she is like when we are alone. She will make me pay for this interference tonight, and it would have been better if you had just let her strike me again. It is never better to let cruelty go unanswered, Gabriel said, his voice firm and steady as he looked down into her eyes. I learned that lesson myself a very long time ago, and the cost of my silence was far too high to ever forget. He held her gaze, his presence acting like a solid wall between her and the rest of the world. Tell me who she is to you. She is my stepmother, Victoria Linwood, Maeve said, her voice flattening out with a deep, weary sadness that spoke of years of quiet suffering. My father married her when I was 15 years old, but he passed away 2 years ago and left everything under her control. She lifted her chin slightly, the same brave gesture she had used when facing the second blow from her stepmother. The will keeps me in her care until I marry, which she ensures will never happen, because an unmarried stepdaughter can be forced to work as a free housekeeper. I manage her home, I take care of her every comfort, and whenever she is bored or angry, she reminds me of my place. Maeve continued, looking at Gabriel with an honesty that touched something deep inside him. I have learned to endure it on my own, and I never asked for anyone to help me today, though your action was very kind. She looked at his expensive clothes and his striking appearance, shaking her head gently. You have a position in this town, and tomorrow everyone will gossip about why a wealthy man defended a penniless girl like me, so I beg you to walk away now. No, Gabriel said simply, his voice cracking out like a small pistol shot in the quiet space between them. Maeve blinked in surprise, her lips parting slightly as she tried to process his refusal to leave her side. Gabriel turned his head slowly, his dark eyes sweeping over the 200 well-bred guests who were still watching them with fascinated, judgmental faces. He looked at Victoria, who was standing a few feet away, trembling with a mixture of intense rage and social embarrassment. Gabriel raised his voice for the first time, letting his clear words carry across the entire lawn to the farthest edges of the garden hedges. I have something to say to all of you, since you have all chosen to make yourselves witnesses to this afternoon's events, he announced, his voice cold and cutting. I have stood among you at many of these dull gatherings, and I always thought you were merely tedious people, but I see now that I was far too generous. The guests flinched slightly under his intense gaze, several of them looking down at the grass to avoid his eyes. I just watched every single one of you stand by while a young woman was struck across the face, and not a single person moved to assist her, Gabriel said, his words falling like heavy stones upon the silent crowd. You drew back, you made room for the violence, and you prepared your faces to enjoy the scandal, like a theater show. He stepped closer to Maeve, his white hair gleaming in the sunlight, as he kept his body positioned between her and the onlookers. You will go home tonight and tell each other that she must have done something wrong to deserve it, because that lie is much easier than admitting you are cowards. His cold gaze swept over the crowd one last time, forcing the wealthiest citizens of Oakhaven to turn away in shame. You have called me a cold man behind my back for years, whispering about my isolation and my lack of friends, Gabriel stated, a small, dark smile touching his lips. But look at yourselves today. I have never struck a woman in a garden, nor have I stood in a smiling crowd to watch it happen. So whatever I am far warmer than any of you. The silence across the lawn was total, no one daring to speak a single word in response to his heavy accusation. Gabriel turned back to Maeve, his expression softening instantly as he reached out and offered her his right arm. Miss Linwood, will you allow me to escort you out of this garden immediately? He asked, his tone gentle and polite. You do not need to remain here to be stared at by these people, as you have endured quite enough for one afternoon. He pointed toward the long driveway where his classic black car was parked, its polished metal shining near the front gates. My vehicle is entirely at your disposal, and I give you my word that no one will ever raise a hand or a voice to you again. You may return to your stepmother's house later, if that is truly what you wish, and I will not stop you, Gabriel added, looking at her with absolute sincerity. But you will not walk out of this place alone, with that mark on your face. passing by 200 people who did nothing to protect you. He kept his arm extended, waiting patiently for her response. Walk out on my arm, with your head held high, and let every person in this town wonder, for the rest of their lives, what greatness they failed to see in you. Maeve looked at his offered arm, as if it were a sudden door appearing in a solid brick wall she had been trapped behind for years. Before she could move, Victoria found her voice again, her tone cracking out like a leather whip across the grass. "Maeve!" the older woman shouted, her face red with anger as she realized her control over the girl was slipping away in public. "You will not touch him. Come back here to me this instant, because you are forgetting your place and what you are." She stepped forward, pointing an angry finger at Gabriel while trying to sound authoritative to the watching guests. "This man is simply amusing himself at your expense, and you are a fool if you think a wealthy gentleman means anything by noticing a girl like you." She laughed bitterly, a harsh sound that failed to hide her growing desperation. "He will cast you aside before the week is over, and I will be the one left to clean up the mess. So come here right now, or you will regret this forever." Gabriel watched the older woman's words land, noting how they were exactly the wrong thing to say to a person who had reached her limit. He saw a change pass over Maeve's face, as the 2 years of quiet submission met the alternative he was offering her. She looked at Victoria, then looked back at Gabriel's pale hand, her jaw tightening as she made a final decision. She stepped forward and placed her small hand firmly upon his arm, her fingers feeling ice-cold and trembling slightly against his dark suit coat. Gabriel covered her fingers briefly with his own free hand, steadying her trembling touch and letting her feel the solid, unchanging strength of his presence. Maeve drew a deep, long breath, the first real breath she had taken since the slap had silenced the afternoon party. "No," she said to her stepmother, her voice shaking slightly, but remaining clear and resolute enough for everyone to hear. "I do not think I will regret this choice at all, because I have spent 2 years regretting my silence. I have never once regretted the few times I found the courage to speak up for myself," Maeve continued, her grip tightening on Gabriel's arm as she turned away from the older woman. "And I find that I have just enough courage left today to walk out of this garden on my own feet, next to a man who was kind to me." She looked back at her stepmother one last time, with a calm, steady expression. "You may deal with the scandal yourself, madam, because you created it with your own hand in front of the entire town." She walked with Gabriel up the shallow stone steps, her head held high despite the dark bruise developing on her left cheek. They crossed the wide terrace and entered the grand house, passing through a silent, staring crowd that parted quickly to let them through. Gabriel matched his long stride to her smaller steps, looking straight ahead and ignoring the whispers that were already starting to rise behind them. Victoria was left standing entirely alone on the green grass, surrounded by the wreckage of her own cruelty, having lost her servant in 5 minutes. They did not speak a single word until they had left the house, climbed into the back of his quiet car, and the engine had started up. The grand estate with its rows of staring windows began to slide away behind them as the driver steered the vehicle down the long gravel driveway. Once they passed the main gates, Maeve finally let go of her rigid posture, dropped her head into her hands, and began to weep. It was a silent, exhausted crying, the deep release of someone who had held back her pain and sorrow for far too long. Gabriel sat quietly across from her, not touching her or telling her to stop, choosing instead to give her the space to let the tears fall. Gabriel watched her quietly, understanding that she had spent 2 long years training herself never to show weakness in front of the woman who controlled her life. He knew that this forced strength, more than the physical blow in the garden, was the true measure of the damage Victoria had caused. When her tears finally stopped, he handed her a clean white handkerchief, which she used to dry her eyes and wipe her damp cheeks. She looked at him with red-rimmed eyes, her breath catching slightly as she tried to compose herself in the quiet interior of the car. "You have ruined your own reputation for me, you know," Maeve said softly, twisting the white cloth between her small fingers. "A man of your standing does not carry off a penniless girl from a high society party without everyone talking." She looked out the window at the green trees passing by. "By tomorrow morning, the people in this town will be saying the most terrible things about both of us, and your quiet life will be completely disrupted." "Let them say whatever they wish," Gabriel replied, his voice calm and completely indifferent to the opinions of the townspeople. "I have been the subject of rumors for many decades, and I care very little for the thoughts of 200 people who watched a girl get struck and did nothing." He leaned back against the leather seat. "Their good opinion is not something I value, Miss Linwood, and I would much rather be scorned by them than praised for matching their cowardice." "But you did not have to get involved," Maeve said, turning her head to look directly into his pale face. "That is the part I do not understand, because you do not know me at all, and you had never seen my face before this afternoon." She shook her head gently. "You could have stayed on your safe terrace, let the event happen like everyone else did, and your life would have continued exactly as it was before." Gabriel remained silent for a moment, watching the familiar roads of Oakhaven pass by outside the glass windows of the automobile. He decided that he wanted to tell this human girl the truth about his past, or at least as much as her human mind could understand. "I had a younger sister once," Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a low, quiet tone that filled the small space between them. "Her name was Charlotte, and after our parents died, she was left entirely in my care. I was the head of our family, responsible for her well-being, but in those years, I was exactly the cold, careless man that society believes me to be now," he continued. "I was entirely focused on my own dark concerns, and did not pay attention to her life as I should have." His pale hands tightened slightly on his knees. "She married a charming but deeply cruel man, someone I did not bother to examine closely, because doing so would have required effort. He was unkind to her, slowly at first, and then constantly, stripping away her joy until she was a shadow of herself," Gabriel said, his jaw tightening at the memory. "Charlotte wrote to me twice, hinting at her misery, but never speaking plainly, because our family pride was very strong." He looked out the window. "I ignored those hints because acting upon them would have been inconvenient for my routine, and I preferred my isolation. She passed away from a sudden winter fever 4 years ago, in a cold house where she had not known a single day of happiness," Gabriel stated bluntly. "I stood at her graveside and realized too late that my sister had been suffering for years, within a short distance of my own home." He looked back at Maeve. She had reached out to me for protection, and I had failed to come because I made a virtue out of not caring about anyone else. "So when you ask me why I crossed that garden today, that is the only answer I can give you," Gabriel said, his dark eyes fixed on her face. "I stood on that terrace and saw a woman struck, while a crowd of wealthy cowards drew back to enjoy the entertainment." He shook his head slowly. "For 1 second, I felt like I was standing at my sister's graveside again, seeing the result of my own cold indifference. I realized that I could not stand by a second time, watching a cruelty happen, and telling myself it was none of my concern," he added. "It became my concern the moment my eyes saw it, and so I did for a stranger what I failed to do for Charlotte." He leaned forward slightly. "It was not an act of heroism, Miss Linwood. It was simply a man trying to be less of a coward than he was in the past." Maeve did not say anything for a long time, but her dark eyes never left his pale face as he finished speaking his quiet truth. Then, she reached across the small space between their seats, extended her hand slowly, and laid her fingers over his pale hand where it rested on his knee. She pressed his hand gently, a simple gesture of comfort, meant for someone who was carrying a heavy weight of grief. "Then I am very glad it was I who was in the garden today," she said softly, her voice filled with genuine warmth. "I am truly sorry for the loss of your sister, Mr. Cross," Maeve continued, her fingers warm against his cold, marble-like skin. "But I think if she could have seen you walk across that grass today, she would not think you a coward at all." She smiled gently at him. I think she would be very proud of the man you showed yourself to be this afternoon." Gabriel looked down at her small hand resting over his own, feeling the quiet heat of her life against his skin, and found he could not speak for several seconds. When he finally answered her, his voice was lower and less steady than it had been before. "You have a dark mark forming on your cheek. You have just been threatened in public, and you are sitting in a stranger's car comforting him," he said. "I have known you for less than an hour, Miss Linwood, and I am already certain you are the most remarkable person I have ever encountered," Gabriel murmured. Maeve gave him a small, wet smile, the very first one he had seen from her, and it transformed her grave features completely. Gabriel realized right then, with the absolute certainty of a man who had avoided human emotions for centuries, that his quiet life was about to change forever. He did not instruct his driver to take her back to the house where Victoria lived, though he had promised her the choice when they were standing on the lawn. During the drive, Maeve had quietly explained the true reality of her life in that home, describing the constant isolation her stepmother had engineered to keep her friendless. Victoria had driven away the only two respectable men who had ever shown interest in Maeve, ensuring the girl remained trapped under her absolute control. Gabriel listened to the details of this slow destruction of a young woman who used to laugh, and his pale face grew harder with every sentence she spoke. When she finished speaking, Gabriel looked out at the evening shadows, stretching across the Virginia hills. "You are never going back to that house again," he said firmly. And Maeve, who had spent 2 years believing she had no other place in the world to go, found that she trusted his words completely. He directed the driver toward a large, comfortable estate on the edge of town belonging to his older aunt, Beatrice. Aunt Beatrice was a sharp-tongued but incredibly kind old woman who had lived in Oakhaven for 40 years and had spent 2 decades worrying about her nephew's cold isolation. Gabriel led Maeve into the wide entry hall of the house and explained the entire situation to his aunt in 10 short, blunt sentences. The old woman took one look at the red mark on Maeve's pale face, her eyes flashing with instant anger at Victoria's cruelty. She immediately folded the young woman into a gentle embrace, turning to her nephew with an expression of deep approval that he had not seen in a long time. "Gabriel, you have finally performed a decent action," Beatrice said, her voice brisk but warm as she patted Maeve's shoulder. "I was beginning to think you had lost your humanity completely somewhere in that big house of yours, but I see you simply kept it hidden." She waved her hand toward the front door. "Go home now. Leave this child with me where she is safe, and she will stay here for as long as she needs. If that dreadful Linwood woman comes to my front door demanding her return, I shall enjoy myself enormously turning her away," the old woman added with a sharp smile. "Come back tomorrow morning to visit us, because I can see very well that you will want to check on her." Gabriel did want to return, and he did so the very next morning, bringing a small basket of fresh fruit from his own gardens. He came back the day after that, and the day after that, beginning a slow, patient courtship in Beatrice's warm drawing room over the weeks that followed. He treated Maeve with the careful respect needed for someone who had been taught by 2 years of abuse to fear every sudden movement or loud voice. He did not overwhelm her with expensive gifts or dramatic speeches, knowing that grandeur would only cause her to retreat into her old protective silence. Instead, he simply came to sit with her every afternoon, talking about ordinary things, listening to her thoughts, and letting her see that his presence was constant. He wanted her to learn that the man who had caught her stepmother's wrist was not a temporary protector, but a solid rock she could rely upon every single day. As the warm summer weeks slipped into autumn, Gabriel watched Maeve slowly come back to life, a process that became one of the greatest privileges of his existence. The constant look of fear and wariness left her face by degrees, replaced by a quiet confidence that made her dark eyes shine. She began to laugh again, at first catching herself in surprise as if she expected to be punished for feeling joy. But soon her laughter filled the old house. Gabriel found himself doing ridiculous things, like recounting foolish stories about his past travels, simply for the pleasure of hearing the bright sound of her voice. The stillness that had once looked like the caution of a hunted animal became the calm peace of a woman who knew she was completely safe. Her fine-boned face bloomed over those quiet weeks, losing its thin, exhausted look, and becoming so beautiful to him that it routinely took his breath away. Meanwhile, Victoria Linwood did not accept her sudden public defeat with grace, as she was a woman who valued control above all things. She came to Aunt Beatrice's house twice during the first fortnight, loudly demanding that her stepdaughter return home immediately to fulfill her legal duties. She tried using threats of lawsuits, then shifted to loud proclamations of maternal love that failed to convince anyone who had witnessed the garden party. Aunt Beatrice sent her away both times with a fierce satisfaction, later confessing to Maeve that the confrontations had done more for her elderly spirits than a dozen card parties. When these direct attempts failed, Victoria turned to the drawing rooms of Oakhaven, trying to spread her poison against the girl. Victoria visited every home that would still receive her, whispering malicious stories about how Maeve had deliberately planned the scene in the garden to catch a wealthy man. She claimed the girl was a scheming, penniless nobody who had entrapped Mr. Cross, and that a stepmother had every legal right to discipline an unruly ward. But the high society of Oakhaven did not swallow the older woman's lies this time, because 200 people had stood on that lawn and seen the truth. They had watched a cruel woman strike a silent girl and prepare to hit her again, and a lie cannot survive against 200 eyewitnesses. There was another factor that completely destroyed Victoria's campaign to ruin Maeve's reputation in the town. Gabriel Cross, the man who had never bothered to explain his actions to anyone, began appearing regularly in public, with Maeve resting her hand on his arm. He took her to the local opera house, to evening concerts in the park, and to the few small gatherings that Aunt Beatrice organized for them. Whenever they walked together, he looked down at her with an expression of quiet devotion that no one could mistake for entrapment or charity. Anyone who saw his face realized instantly that the reclusive man had chosen this girl with his whole heart, and that he was completely glad of his choice. The town gossip turned slowly, as it always does when power and truth are aligned against a single cruel person. Society shifted its sympathies away from Victoria, and the wealthy families began closing their parlor doors to her visits one by one. The truth about the Linwood household began to emerge naturally once the town stopped protecting the stepmother's social standing out of convenience. People openly discussed how Victoria had mistreated the girl for 2 years, squandering a large portion of the money her husband had left in trust for his daughter. They realized that Maeve had kept the house running, endured the cruelties in silence, and carried herself with a dignity that shamed everyone who had known the truth. By the end of the autumn season, Victoria had packed her trunks and left Oakhaven permanently, claiming she needed a different climate for her failing health. She had raised her hand in public, confident in her absolute power, and had lost everything to the quiet girl she had tried to break. Gabriel did not waste his thoughts on the departed woman, feeling only a distant contempt that required no further energy or action on his part. Once Maeve was safe and happy in his aunt's home, his initial anger simply faded away into the busy routine of his new life. He asked Maeve to marry him on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in Beatrice's backyard garden, choosing a spot among the late-blooming roses with no audience. She had been made a public spectacle once before 200 strangers, and he wanted her proposal to be entirely private, with only the roses watching. He did not make a grand, dramatic speech, as he was still a man who preferred simple words over empty eloquence. He took both of her warm hands in his own pale fingers, looked down into the beautiful face that had returned to life, and spoke the truth. "I walked across a crowded garden for you, the very first day I saw your face, Maeve," he said softly, his voice steady. "And I have been walking toward you every day since then, and I want to keep walking beside you for the rest of my years. I spent a very long time being called a cold man, and I allowed myself to believe that isolation was safer than caring for someone," Gabriel continued. "But I was completely wrong, because it was only lonely, and I lacked the courage to change until you showed me how." He pressed her hands gently. "You have given me a warmth I did not know I could feel, and a real reason to be glad I am alive. Marry me, Maeve, not because I stepped in to assist you that day, because you had already saved your own spirit by refusing to break," Gabriel said. "Marry me simply because I love you completely, and because I dare to hope that you have come to feel the same warmth for me." Maeve, who had wept in his car out of sorrow weeks ago, felt tears rise again for an entirely different reason. She did not try to hide her wet eyes or apologize for her emotion, which showed Gabriel how much she had healed. "I do love you, Gabriel," Maeve answered, her voice clear and strong as she looked up into his dark eyes. "I think I have loved you since the moment you spoke my name so gently in that terrible garden, when I felt completely alone." She squeezed his pale fingers with her own. "No one had used my name with kindness for 2 long years, and you stood between me and the person who was hurting me. You crossed a whole yard of people who despised me. You looked at me like I mattered, and you gave me back my identity," she whispered. "I decided that afternoon that whatever happened next, I would always remember that a stranger had known my name and protected me from harm." She smiled through her tears. "Yes, Gabriel, I will marry you, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful that the coldest man in this town turned out to be the warmest." They were married in the early spring, a small and quiet ceremony held at Gabriel's large country estate just outside Oakhaven. Aunt Beatrice wept happily from the front row of wooden benches, surrounded by a small group of true friends who cared about their happiness. They invited none of the high society that had stood by during the garden party, as neither Gabriel nor Maeve wanted to provide those citizens with another public show. Maeve wore a simple gown of ivory silk, her pale skin completely clear of any marks or bruises as she walked down the aisle. When she came toward him, Gabriel thought about the lonely girl in the faded green dress who had stood near the roses, holding a glass of water. He remembered how close he had come to staying on his stone terrace, letting her walk out of his life forever, and he felt the last remnants of his old coldness vanish. In the years that followed, the master and mistress of the Cross estate became known throughout the county for something that surprised the local gossips. They were openly, deeply, and completely happy, spending their days improving the lives of the people who worked on their lands. The reclusive man who had held the world at a distance for decades was now seen walking through the valleys, with his wife's hand tucked into his arm. He laughed easily at the things she said, watching her across every room they entered, as if he still could not believe his own good fortune. Maeve proved to be exactly the woman he had glimpsed during that single afternoon, remaining kind, steady, and quietly brave in everything she did. She possessed a deep tenderness for anyone who was overlooked or mistreated by the wealthy, because she had lived through that darkness herself. She reopened the estate's old charities, using Gabriel's vast resources to build a small school and a safe home for young women who had no families. It became known quietly throughout the state that if any person in Oakhaven were cornered, mistreated, or left without protection, they could send a message to the Cross estate. Gabriel and Maeve would always answer the call. The woman who had once been struck, and the man who had finally learned to cross a crowded yard to stop the blow. The autumn evening was cool and quiet, as Maeve walked along the stone path of their own garden, the long shadows of the cedar trees stretching across the grass. Gabriel walked beside her, his white hair catching the silver light of the rising moon, his pale hand holding hers with a familiar, comforting warmth. She stopped near a bush of late-blooming red roses, leaning down to breathe in the sweet, crisp scent of the petals, before turning to look at her husband. He was watching her with that same steady, devoted expression he always wore when they were alone together in the quiet parts of the day. Maeve looked out over the fields, toward the distant lights of the town, her mind turning back to the long journey they had shared since that hot summer afternoon. She knew that her husband was not an ordinary man, having learned the secret of his long, hidden life during their first year of marriage. but the knowledge had only made her love him more deeply. She thought about the future stretching out before them, a long and bright horizon that no longer held the cold fear of her early youth. She understood now that true safety was not the absence of trouble, but the presence of someone who would stand beside you when the storm arrived. The memory of her father's loss, and the 2 years of quiet misery under her stepmother's roof, had faded into a soft, distant background, no longer carrying the power to hurt her. She realized that every difficult step she had taken on that rough path had brought her directly to this quiet garden and the protection of the man with the silver hair. She looked at his pale face, seeing the deep peace that had settled into his features over the years, replacing the hard, freezing look he had worn when he first caught Victoria's wrist. They had built a sanctuary together, a place where the broken pieces of their pasts had been mended into something strong and lasting. Maeve felt a deep, quiet gratitude for the simple reality of their daily life, for the shared morning meals, the afternoon walks, and the silent understanding that existed between them. She knew that they would encounter new challenges as the years passed, but she no longer felt the old wariness that had once guarded her heart against the world. She leaned her head against Gabriel's solid shoulder, closing her eyes as the cool evening breeze moved through the rose bushes around them. The future was an open door, and she was completely ready to walk through it, holding the hand of the man who had taught her that love was the greatest warmth of all.